What is a seller rent back period? Hey everybody, this is Brad Decater with the Decater Real Estate Group. On this channel we talk about all things real estate and our local market, buyer tips, seller tips, what's going on here in King County, Washington. So thanks for tuning in. Alright guys, so in this video we're going to go over what a seller rent back period is, and most importantly what to look out for when you're both on the seller side and also the buyer side, and what it really means by entering into this agreement. So first off, what is it? A seller rent back period is pretty simple. It's just the seller, the person who's selling the house, is asking for a period of time where they can rent the property from the new buyer. So they're going to basically essentially stay in the house they're living at now. Typically it's because they want to go buy a house, somewhere else, and they need time to shop for that house, or maybe they're building a house somewhere else and they can't move in until this specific date. And so this gives them the time they need to actually have a nice smooth transition between closing this house and moving and getting into their new house. There's of course a variety of reasons why someone might want to do this, but it is very common at this time that sellers are asking for rent back periods so that they can kind of get their ducks in a row for their next transition to their next house. So that's what it is, and in this market, as of shooting here February 2022, it's a very competitive market and it's a seller's market. So sellers have the upper hand. So if they are asking for a rent back period, it's pretty likely that they're going to get one because most properties are getting multiple offers, 5, 10, 15, 20 offers on the property. And so of course to stand out as the buyer, it's a good idea to try and accommodate the seller's term because you want your offer accepted. So it's a good chance that the offer that they do accept is going to be okay with their asking for the rent back period. Okay, so we'll jump into some things to look out for. So on the seller side, honestly, not too much. I think for both sides, it's important that you make sure that your agents or whoever's helping you guys out, that this is all contractual. So I definitely would not make it verbal, obviously. So even though the rent back period doesn't happen until the house closes, so technically it's done outside of escrow, you still want to make this contractual and have escrow having this paperwork. So it's all done when the offer is made. So make sure you have an addendum that's attached that kind of outlines the specific terms of the agreement. So for both sides, I would really make sure to look out for what is agreed upon for the actual rent amount. In this market, a lot of times it's zero because the buyers are offering them a free rent back along with a bunch of other crazy things that they can do to try and get their offer accepted. But obviously outline the actual amount of money that's due for rent. Another one that is usually overlooked is the utilities. So who's going to pay the utilities? Typically, the landlord is not going to be paying for the utilities. And since it's already in the person's name that lives there, most likely it'll be that way. But again, just make sure there's a contract for it in the proper form for your MLS. So just tip number one, just make sure it's in contract and you guys have this thing all spelled out in either a regular lease or an addendum to the person's sale agreement, which outlines this rent back period, which is kind of an alternative to an actual lease. So now as the buyer, here's where it gets a little dicey. So as the buyer, if you're the buyer putting an offer in to buy the property and they are asking for a rent back period and you and your agent are discussing, hey, should I give them this rent back period? What should we charge them? Should I do it at all? Fill me in. That's where it gets a little dicey. So as the buyer, it's pretty risky, honestly, for you guys to be getting into a rent back period. I wouldn't say pretty risky. It's just something that you should be aware about. There's definitely some liability that comes along with doing these types of rent back situations. When this happens, it goes outside of a traditional, purchase and sale agreement and regular sale where that there's a closing date. They're going to be out of the house on that date. You take possession on that day. It's verified. Once you're there, it's your house, you live there. That's just a standard transaction. So it gets a little tricky here because now you just bought this house. So as of the closing date, you're the new owner of the property, but these people are still living there and they're now your tenants. So when this happens, it just changes the dynamic of the situation and you are now a landlord, they are now your tenant. And so when that happens, things completely change. And so the liability comes into play because you're now the landlord. And so now you're subject to tenant-landlord laws. So a little side tip, if you're going to be doing this, I would also kind of brush up on what the tenant and landlord laws are in your area because different states are more tenant friendly and different states are more landlord friendly. So definitely know what your state and legislation is doing with as far as how these tenant and landlords are treated by the law. In Washington, it's a pretty tenant-friendly state, so it's a little bit difficult to be the landlord, which is why I typically advise my buyers against it, or at least I let them know what they're getting into, because I actually do, for the most part, feel okay about it in most cases. It's still really good to know that there is liability and there is risk. So the main risk that you're taking on when you're doing this is, of course, now that you're the landlord, if they decide not to leave at the end of their lease agreement, at that point, even though the purchase and sale and the rental says this, you're now in different laws. So if they didn't do that, it would be just like a regular eviction. And evictions can be messy. So now, you thought you're going to be moving in 30 days. And then if they're still in there, well, a big problem for you because you now have to evict this person. And you're treating them just like a tenant. And if you know anything about evictions, I mean, sure, it could go nice and smooth and happen pretty quickly, but it could drag on. It could take a long time. They could be in there for 6 months, a year without paying rent. So that's like your worst case scenario, like main reason why there's some serious liability involved and risk involved if you're the buyer that's going to be getting into one of those seller rent back periods. Now, with all that being said, to put it into perspective, I mean, I've done this for sure. My goal is just to tell my buyers what the liability is and how it is risky. In the end, it's their decision. And when it comes down to getting the house or not getting the house, if that's the deal breaker, I typically am still okay with it. And the reason is because these people that are selling their house, they're not a likely person to pull one of these stunts of, not leaving the house or trashing the house or any other things that a tenant might do that would be, a hardship or a bad thing for the landlord. And the reason is because in this market, virtually everybody who's selling is making a bunch of money. And they're obviously selling for a reason. They're doing something else. They're going somewhere. So they're not usually the type of people that are going to be doing this whole squatting and kind of like terrorizing your life and going through an eviction with you there. I mean, eviction is going to hurt them too. They don't want to go through that. So I think for the most part, it's low likelihood of anything bad happening just because of the caliber of the person we're dealing with. Considering that they've been a homeowner for a while, they're probably making a few $100,000s off this sale. So they're in a good position. They don't really have any reason to go screw people over and stay in the house unless obviously something could happen on their end where, hey, like their house they got kicked out of their contract, they got bumped out of it or something, and now they have nowhere to go. But again, still a pretty small risk, but definitely good to know that there is some risk and liability involved on the buyer side. So that's my main tip is for the buyers. Hey, if you guys are considering a rent back period, just know what you're getting into and maybe take some precautions to try and protect that. So what are some alternatives, or is there any way to protect yourself from this? So as the buyer, I would say the best way to protect yourself if you really want no risk and liability is to not do the rent back period and try and satisfy the seller in a different way with either other terms, or if they really want the extra time period, maybe offer an extended closing period. Because that's much more beneficial to you, not so much them. But let's just say that they wanted a 30-day rent back period. So you're gonna have like a 30-day escrow and a 30-day rent back. You could end up saying, hey, I'm just not comfortable with this rent back period because of what I learned from this video and there's all this liability, it's kind of a bad idea. But what if, because I know you wanted a little bit of extra time, what if we just did a 60-day escrow and we closed in 60 days? So that they still have their same move out date, but for you, they're not ever renting the property. You're just having an extended escrow period, meaning you're just not getting the keys and not getting title and not owning the house until that date, which is a lot better than having the rent back period, in my opinion. The seller may not like this idea because they don't get paid until it closes. So the whole kind of benefit for them is that they can get their money early so they can go shopping for their new house while they stay in their house. But just something, it's a kind of a tip or a trick for you guys to do is to ask if they'd be okay with the extended closing as opposed to the rent back period. So I hope that answers your guys' questions on seller rent back periods. If you have any more questions or any clarifying questions or something like that or comments, put them down there. Let me know. And again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.